Deputy Boyd Barrett, your organisation, so people before Profit and yourself are advocating people to vote no in the upcoming referendum. And so we want to ask you, what impact do you feel a no vote would have for 16 to 25-year-olds in Ireland?
Well, I think if we don't defeat the treaty, then I think it is going to have a very significant impact on young people for many years to come, as they come out of school and out of college and seek employment, or indeed even while they're in school and college, in terms of the resources that are available to them while they're there, because the targets to reduce our debt and our deficit over a particular time frame, which the treaty require, is going to mean really savage cuts in public spending in areas like education, and it is also going to mean that there will be very few jobs around. In fact, I think it's going to deepen the economic decline of the country, which we've seen result from the austerity that's been imposed so far. I think we're going to see that intensify. And it means permanent mass unemployment will become a sort of feature of Irish society for many years to come. So I think sadly it's going to have a very major effect on young people. And that's why we think we have to vote no to this treaty and open up the possibility of an alternative set of policies. Now, I don't want to pretend the alternative is easy, we're not saying that. Either way, we're in a deep crisis and the situation is very challenging, but we believe to continue down the road we've gone down for the last 4 years is crazy, because it's clearly not working. And to simply do more of the same is just going to make the situation worse. So we're arguing that we should oppose this, repudiate the gambling debts of bankers and financial institutions, and that would put us in a lot better position. But there does also need to be a significant redistribution of wealth in this country in order to get the public finances back in order and to provide the state with money to invest where we can create jobs and invest in developing our public services. So that's why we're arguing for a no vote, and I think it would be very much in the interest of young people to vote no on that basis.
So how would voting no make sure we secure that cash that we need going forward?
Well, voting no on its own is not going to solve our problems, and we're not saying that. And I think, frankly, the voters should distrust anybody who says voting either way on this is going to sort everything out. It isn't. The reason we're arguing for no vote is because we're saying if this treaty is ratified, then we cut off alternative routes for getting us out of the crisis, and we continue down the same road we've been on for the last number of years, a road that I think has demonstrably failed in this country and indeed is failing now across Europe. It has led to greater levels of unemployment, it has led to vicious attacks on the incomes and services of ordinary people, and there is no sign of recovery. So we're saying we have to move in a different direction, and voting no to this treaty is the first step in moving in an alternative direction. But there has to be more than simply voting no, and we're not pretending otherwise. There has to be a radical change of policy. We have to bring, for example, the financial system under public control, in our opinion. The idea that banks can simply be allowed run amok for profit after what has happened, we think that has to end. The banking system has to be brought under public control. Their policies have to be directed towards the common good. And we need to redistribute the wealth that has become accumulated in the hands of a very small minority at the top of our society and re-inject that back into society in a fair way and invest it in the interests of society as a whole, instead of running an economy purely on the basis of profit and individual greed.
You've kind of answered in some ways there one of our Twitter followers, Owen's questions, but maybe you might elaborate on it a little bit more. Owen sent us in a tweet and he said he feels austerity hasn't worked since 2008, and he feels if the treaty is passed, what makes people think it will work now? And what Owen wanted to ask the no side was, what will work to bring the country back up on its feet again? So you've kind of been.
Yes, well, I think I've touched on it. I mean, I think it's clearly apparent that austerity is not working, and it's not just the no side in Ireland that are saying this now. I mean, there is a huge revolt going on right across Europe against the austerity agenda that has been pursued for the last 4 years, and we've seen dramatic changes in the political landscape in France. In Portugal and Spain, there's massive protests of young people in particular because of the huge levels of youth unemployment that have resulted from the austerity programme. We've seen in Holland the government has fallen, in Austria the government has fallen. So people are crying out for an alternative to a failed austerity policy. What is the alternative? Well, as I said, I think it has to begin with taking into public control the financial institutions that caused the crisis in the first place. I mean, if they continue to allowed to run amok in the way they have over the last 10 or 15 years, there is no solution to this crisis. And part of the reason we're opposing this treaty is because it proposes continuing the policy of bailing out the private banks and essentially relying on them to restore our economic fortunes. We think that is absolutely crazy. So we need to bring them into public ownership, control their policies, and ensure that they are lending and investing on a rational, sensible basis for things that society actually needs, that will generate jobs, generate real industry and enterprise that can benefit society and which is sustainable over the medium and long term. And we also need to redistribute wealth in a fair way. I mean, the gap between rich and poor in this country has grown massively, similarly right across Europe and right across the world. That's what the sort of economics of greed that was pursued for the last 25 years has done. It's concentrated the wealth in a very few hands, and that's both unfair, but it's also a very unstable way to organise an economy, because the whim of a very small number of people can wreck an entire economy. So we think you have to have progressive taxation, taxes on wealth, taxes on the higher income earners, to redistribute the wealth in a fair way, to have a more equal society, and where the resources are used for the benefit of society as a whole, and invest in things that make sense, you know, education, the infrastructure of a country, developing natural resources and strategic areas of enterprise which can actually create employment and benefit the society as a whole.
Do decision makers like yourself feel that these young people need to be consulted in relation to these kind of constitutional amendments that have the potential to have a long-term impact on their lives?
Absolutely. I mean, I first of all, I don't see myself as a decision maker,
Okay.
but I mean, I understand why you put it in those terms, and that's part of the problem, is that we don't have a sufficiently thoroughgoing democracy where every section of society, and very particularly young people, don't have enough say. And I think that's part of the problem. Decisions are being made by very, very small numbers of people, and there are people who tend to be at the top of society, who tend to be quite wealthy, and who imagine that their own interests are the interests of everybody else, but in fact they're not. And I think we need, if you like, civil society, and young people, I think, will always spearhead progressive movements like this, needs to, if you like, take back the political system for the people. So I would encourage people on that basis not just to vote no, but more importantly to become active. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Portugal and Spain, in France, where things are beginning to shift in a better direction, it's because masses of people have been out on the streets protesting, and students and young people have been very central to that, demanding a better and a fairer way of doing things, and demanding more say in the priorities of their society. And I think that is going to be the key here as much as anywhere else.
And what do you see a difference between Ireland and those kind of countries like Greece, Spain and Portugal, where there's been more of a mass of young people moving and kind of taking action, whereas here there is a significant amount of young people? It doesn't seem to be on the same scale. Do you think it's a time thing, or what's your view on that?
I think there's a number of factors to it, but I think it's partly a time thing. I mean, I think people when the crisis first hit here, many people thought, well, maybe we have to take a little bit of pain, a little bit of sacrifice, and then things will improve. Mm-hmm. So we don't need to protest. I think as time has gone on, people are realising the situation is getting worse, not better, and we're beginning to see protests taking place in the last few months, and I think we're likely to see more of that. And I certainly hope we will, because I think unless people get out and put real pressure on the political establishment, nothing changes. But I think that is likely to happen. I don't believe there's anything about the Irish that makes them less inclined to protest. We have a very proud history of radical politics and protest in this country, but maybe it has been somewhat weakened by 25 years of the Celtic Tiger. where people felt as if everything was okay and didn't really need to engage in politics. But I think it's vitally important that people who weren't engaged in politics up until now really do get back engaged, and particularly young people, because it is their future that is at stake really in these things. And I mean, I think there's also a question of Civil War politics, maybe a little bit, have weakened the protest tradition in this country, but that's beginning to break up now as well. So I think we're likely to see new political formations with young people involved in them, breaking up the old political establishment, and the sooner the better that happens, in my opinion. We
also had kind of a lot of young people come to us expressing their confusion around the referendum, both with the treaty itself and the wording of the amendment to the Constitution, but also in terms of the campaign, where there's messages. It's like any political campaign, messages being thrown around from every arena. What do you feel that TDs, politicians can do to make sure that young people feel informed and engaged in these campaigns?
Well, I think first of all the fact that it's a very, very technical treaty that people are being asked to ratify is telling in itself, because it's indicative of the way in which the political system is very sort of alienated from the concerns and from just the discourse, if you like, of ordinary people, and it has become a technocratic thing. And I think that's part of the problem, is that the elites think there are technocratic solutions to what in fact are societal problems. And I think the more ordinary people trust to their own common sense, and young people trust to their own common sense, and cease to believe that there are these experts who know more and who understand more than they do, and begin to actually say, look, a child could make a better job of this. I think those instincts are actually correct. A child probably could make a better job of running our economy than the so-called experts have over the last 25 years, because actually it's not that difficult to say what should we prioritise, education, health, housing, the environment, rather than what has been prioritised over the last number of years, which has been financial speculation and gambling, a sort of casino economy that has been created by these so-called financial and economic experts. So I think part of what has to change is people being less submissive to their so-called betters or to the experts, and recognising that actually they have the ability and the capacity to run society in a better, more sensible, more rational way, and begin to exert their influence, if you like, on how our society is run.
And just as a little follow-on, what can society do to kind of encourage that aspect of, how can we kind of help to embed that in young people? How can we help to encourage that kind of that thinking?
Well, I mean, for our part in People Before Profit and the United Left Alliance, I mean, the way I suppose we try to be different from the political establishment is we don't primarily see politics as taking place in the door. We're associated with street protests, with being out. I mean, still every Saturday I go out on the street campaigning, taking up petitions, involved in organising public meetings on issues in the area and nationally, because I think if politics is to mean anything, and the issues that you're debating and campaigning on are to mean anything, then it has to be at a very, very grassroots level. And I think that's what we can do, if you like, the people in politics, is bring politics back out onto the street, into the communities and into the workplaces and into the colleges, and encourage people to get involved at that level. If politics continues to be something that's hived off to the rarefied atmosphere of Dáil Éireann, frankly, there's no hope for us.
Okay, thanks very much. Just two more questions for you then, if that's all right. The first one we've had in from asks about the ESM. The question is, does Ireland think it's a good idea to hand over more than €11 billion over 5 years to a new financial institution, the ESM, that he goes on to quote from Article 32 of the treaty, that will enjoy immunity from every form of judicial process, and whose assets can be immune from search, requisition, confiscation, etc. So he's asking about Ireland's ability to pay into this, and I just wanted to put that to you as well.
Well, I mean, naturally enough, I think I agree with the thrust of where he's coming from, and it's a fact that hasn't really been highlighted adequately, I think, during the campaign, is that the ESM, which is being presented by the government as Ireland's saviour, and we must vote for the fiscal treaty so we can access the ESM, what they haven't highlighted is that we have to pay 11 billion into that ESM, or at least we could be called upon to pay 11 billion, and I think very likely we would be, given that the Spanish economy may need to be bailed out soon, possibly the Italian economy. So that fund could be used up fully, and we would be required to stump up that money. And in fact, the ESM provides for more money being required from states that sign up to it. So I think it's a very, very bad deal. And the other interesting thing about the ESM is that it will be immune from any kind of legal action, from any kind of public oversight, even by the political authorities. It will be a complete law unto itself. So it is a very, very undemocratic institution that's being set up, and it indicates a worrying erosion of democracy within the European Union generally as a result of this economic crisis. I mean, we saw in Italy and Greece democratically elected leaders being removed and replaced with bankers and technocrats because there was a possibility of referendums happening in those countries. So that Europe seems to be, in its effort to protect the financial system and markets, it seems to be dismantling grassroots democracy, and I think that's a very worrying trend, and the ESM seems to be part of that. So I think we should resist that very, very strongly, and it's another reason why we should vote no.
A lot of the debate is central around trying to secure funding for Ireland going forward to ensure that we can pay for our kind of the important things, health, education and so on. If we don't have that access to European funding, what do you feel, where do you feel Ireland can get that funding to ensure that we're able to pay for things going forward?
Well, first of all, it implies that the ESM is about funding us, and it isn't about funding us. The ESM funding will be to give us money to pay back the bankers, which the fiscal treaty requires that we do effectively in tying us into repaying an enormous national debt, which is ballooned because the state has taken onto its books the private gambling debts of financial institutions. So from that point of view, I don't accept that the ESM is somehow a saviour. It's not going to be an insurance policy against further attacks and austerity on the people. In fact, getting money from it, a condition of it will be to impose more tax on ordinary people, more privatisation of state assets. So how can we get the money alternatively? Well, first of all, our funding situation wouldn't be half as bad if we didn't have all these debts and the interest repayments on them. So we should repudiate those debts, in my opinion. They're not our debts, we shouldn't have to pay them. There would still be a funding gap, probably in the region of 8 to 10 billion by the time we exit the current EU-IMF programme, and we believe that gap can be filled by having progressive taxation and wealth taxation on the very high earners. Not more taxes on ordinary low and middle income people, not more cuts in public services, but wealth taxes on the multimillionaires in this country, who in fact have not in any way been hit by the austerity that has been imposed. And that could fill the gap if we imposed higher income taxes and a wealth tax, and use that money then to invest in job creation. Because another reason we have a big deficit is because nearly 500,000 people are unemployed. You can't bridge the funding gap while you have that many people not working, because it is people who create wealth. They generate economic growth, and if they're doing nothing, there is no economic growth. They're just a drain on the state's resources. So we have to use what funds we have to put that group of people back to work, doing things useful that will in turn generate tax revenue for the state, which we can use to fund our public services.
And if you had one more thing to say, or something to say to people, young people, again, it's 18 to 25 who are going to be going out and voting in a week's time on the referendum, what would you say to them?
Well, I would say that, if you have had enough of this situation where your prospects when you leave school or university are the dole queue or immigration, and you want to do something about that, then you should come out and, in my opinion, vote no, to send a clear message that we need a different direction. But I think it's also about going beyond the 31st, and I would really encourage people. I mean, the saddest thing for me is to see so many young people leaving the country, because if that continues, this country really is banjaxed. And I would encourage people, I know the temptation to leave, but I would say give it another couple of years and stay and fight. I don't mean in an aggressive way, but in a political way. Get involved politically on the issues that are affecting you. There should be a movement of the unemployed youth in this country demanding jobs, the way there is in Spain. at the moment. Forcing the issue of unemployment and the need for jobs onto the political agenda, I think there should be absolutely strident resistance by students at secondary and third level against any cuts in education, because it's simply crazy to cut education if we're talking about trying to promote economic recovery. So I think those are things that people could practically do, not just vote on the 31st, but get actively involved in fighting to defend education and to demand a job strategy by the government.